In this second video, we're going to start taking a look at building the workflow for automating the process related to our information request form that we built in our first video. If you haven't had a chance to check out the first video, check for a link in the description. To get this workflow started, the first thing that we're going to do is actually add a conditional branch right at the beginning that will determine if the information has been submitted by an agent or by the customer themselves. Under Logic and Flow, we'll go ahead and drag our branch by condition action up onto the canvas. Our configuration will then be when request being completed by authorized agent equals a Boolean value of yes, it will go down our yes branch, otherwise it'll go down our no branch. To make this a little bit more obvious to anyone who might be looking at our workflow in the future, let's go ahead and rename this action to request by agent with a question mark so that they know it's doing that evaluation. To start with, we'll build out our no branch, which is when the customer is filling out the information themselves. Once that's been completed, most of the logic we'll be able to copy over into our yes branch, and it'll save us a lot of time in the long run. The first thing we need to do in our no branch is actually get the document, the file that was uploaded to our form, and pull that into a variable out of the collection that it was held in. Our target collection will be our verification documentation. We'll want to set index to 0 because collections start at an index of 0 and there will be only one item in this collection. And then we'll want to store the item out into a file variable. In this case, we'll go ahead and call it verification documentation, just to keep things simple. And you'll notice throughout this workflow build, I will go through and update action names so that they are more verbose and really explain what the action is doing. This will make it much easier for either myself or someone else to interact with this workflow in the future. Next, we'll actually go down to our SharePoint Online actions and we'll use our create an item action to add our record to our SharePoint list. Now, while I already have a connection in this NWC tenant, you can actually add one directly from the designer if you do not already have one configured. We'll provide the site URL, and then we'll go ahead and select our privacy request list. Now, while the title field is required, we want to make sure that we go in and add all of those fields that we're going to store our data into. Because this is just coming from the customer and not an agent, we won't use the agent fields this time. We'll just select our customer fields down at the bottom. Once those fields are added, we can then use the insert option to dynamically provide that information based on what we captured in the start form. Finally, we want to store the item ID that was created into a variable. So we'll go ahead and say add variable, and we'll just call this item ID. With the item created, the next step will actually be adding that verification documentation that we grabbed in our collection and adding it to the item. So we'll go ahead and use the add attachment to an item action. We'll select our file variable that we created earlier. And then once we've entered our SharePoint information, we'll pass the item ID that we configured in the last action. Next, we want to look at our request type that was submitted on the form, and based on that, do some different logic. If they're simply opting out of our sales process, well, that doesn't really require approval, and instead we can just update that directly in our Salesforce instance. If they're actually requesting information on what we have on them, or they're asking to delete information that is held, there will be an approval process that needs to take place. So first, let's go ahead and add another branch by condition action, and we're going to see if they're opting out of sales. When they are opting out of sales, we will go ahead and just do a query into the environment to find a user that has the same email address as the person making the request. We'll then extract that ID out of the collection that is created via the query, and then use that ID to update the contact information, and finally send the customer an email that says, yes, you have been opted out. When sending emails from Nintex Workflow Cloud, we can continue to use these dynamic values that were provided in our request form, as part of the message body as well. So let's go ahead and add our message. We can say, "Hi, first name. You have been successfully opted out of sales-related engagements. Thank you, Safalo team." While relatively simple, it gets the message across and completes the process for us. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the other side of this conditional branch, where we actually need to do a little bit more interaction with our internal team. To start with, we're going to add another condition, and in this case, we're going to be looking to see if their request is a request for deleting their information. If it is, then we need to go through one set of approval processes to see if that we actually can remove their information or if we need to keep it for operational purposes. If it's not a request to delete, then we can review that information request and send it back to the customer. In both of these branches, we will go ahead and drag on and assign a task. And in both of these cases, we will be using express approvals. However, in this first branch, we will go ahead and add a third outcome. So we'll update these to removed, additional information, or retained. As you add outcomes to a task action, new branches will be created automatically. We're actually going to send this to our internal legal team for review. We'll go ahead and give it a subject of request for information removal. We also want to make sure that we actually attach the verification documentation file to make it easy for our team to review. And then I already have a pre-configured body that I'm going to go ahead and throw into my task here. However, you can customize this the same way you would any other email within Nintex Workflow Cloud. With the task action configured, we now want to configure the outcomes, what happens in each one of those branches. In this case, we're going to just send emails. However, you could add a lot more custom logic depending on the outcome if you so desired. We'll have 3 different emails this time. The first one will send an email back to the customer letting them know that we've removed their information. The second one will be an email letting them know, well, we need more information before we can process this request. And the third one will let them know we had to retain their information for operational purposes. With our delete information request completed, now let's go ahead and take a look at the task that will be assigned if we just need to review an information request. This will also be an express approval, but in this case, we only have 2 different outcomes. And the reality of this is they're both going to be complete. We'll just call one complete and the other completed because the outcome will really be the same. Once we've reviewed the information, we can then send that back to the customer per their request. Within both outcome branches, we'll go ahead and use a send an email action that will provide the information requested from the user back to them. And with that, we've now completed the request process when it's being submitted directly by a customer. Let's go ahead and jump over to take a look at what needs to happen for an agent request to be processed. A lot of this will be exactly the same because it's really the same information, it's just being asked for by another user. So we do need to add a couple more actions and make some slight changes in our action configuration to make sure information is being sent to the right person, in this case, the requesting agent. Before taking a look at the agent branch, let's make sure that we save our workflow. It's important to be saving your workflow throughout your build process so that you don't lose any information. In the agent branch, we actually need to use to get item from collection because we need to grab both documents that were uploaded via the request form, both the agent verification document and the customer request document. Similar to the customer branch, we'll go ahead and set our target collection to our assigned authorized agent permission. We'll use our index of 0, and then we'll store our file out into a new variable. And then in the second action, we can actually reuse a variable from earlier because going down this branch, it will not have been allocated yet. And we'll go ahead and set this to our contact verification document. We'll set our index to 0, and then we'll set our store item to verification documentation file. Now, while I could drag a new SharePoint Online create an item action onto the canvas, we can actually go ahead and just copy the action that we used earlier in our customer branch here within the agent branch. This way, we don't have to rebuild the action from scratch and re-add all of the different fields that we want to populate. However, because the information is coming from that agent request section, we do need to update the fields that exist right now and then add the additional agent fields from our SharePoint list into our configuration. We do still want to store our item ID into our item ID variable. And then this time we'll go ahead and grab our add attachment to item action that we've already configured, and we'll make 2 copies of that. The first is going to be for that agent verification document, the second for the customer. We will need to make sure that we update our file variables that are being referenced. However, all other configuration can be left the same. Finally, instead of rebuilding all of our conditional logic that we built in our customer branch, we can again copy that over into our agent branch and then just go back into our email actions that need to deliver content back to the agent and update that email variable. As you are working with variables within the Nintex Workflow Cloud Designer, it's important to note that there are some shortcuts that you can leverage. In this case, if I wanted to add the agent email, instead of having to open the insert and then look for it, I can just do 2 opening square brackets, type agent email, and hit enter, and the variable will be added for me. And once the emails are done being configured, we've now completed the automated workflow for our privacy information request process. Let's go ahead and publish this and take a look at what the form looks like in the wild. When publishing your workflow in Nintex Workflow Cloud, you can add version comments that will help keep track of what changes were made to the workflow as it progresses over its life cycle. You can also assign the use and determine who this workflow has been shared with. Once published, you will then have access to the public-facing URL. This can be used either on your website, or if you wanted to take the embed code, you can actually embed the form directly into your web page. In this case, let's go ahead and just take a look at this and make sure that things are working as we expect. It looks like our hide rules are working as expected. We can interact with our files, and we can submit the form successfully. Now, something worth noting, these contact fields were all empty when we submitted this form. It might be a good idea to make them required so that when users are coming into your form, you always are capturing good information. Back within our designer, we can then scroll down to the field that we want to make required, select it, and set the required parameter from no to yes. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up this walkthrough. I hope this has been useful in your future workflow development, and we can't wait to see what you build next.